So, this I'm going to fuse together various accounts. As I said yesterday, there's no one kind of authorized version of the Buddha's life story. We've got these sort of myriad of different accounts that are sometimes completely contradictory. So what I've done is I've kind of fused together, being the joiner that I am, I've kind of fused together these different accounts of the Buddha's life into a kind of linear narrative. And I'll try and point out at times if it's important where those accounts have come from. But this is definitely not a scholarly approach to the Buddha's life. It's much more of a sort of emotional, poetic approach. And I was saying yesterday about multiple perspectives, and there are all these multiple perspectives on the Buddha's life, and we just don't know what the truth is. And I'd question this whole idea that there is ever, with anything, this kind of singular truth. I do really question that as a worldview, really. And that somehow we'll get to some sort of objective truth. I was thinking about this, a very simple example of this is the minutes for meetings. Very simple example, you get sent round the minutes of a meeting and you go, I never said that, or they never said that, or that's not how I remember it. And then, when you come to the next meeting and you're confirming the minutes, you hear sometimes you hear the different perspectives of, so there's never one singular kind of version of events. So let us begin. Let us begin with a dream, actually. Let's begin with a dream. So a beautiful princess, Princess Maya, has a dream. She has a dream of a white elephant entering her womb. And soon she discovers she's pregnant. Now, this may or may not be a miraculous conception, because her husband is a king, King Suddhodana, and she becomes pregnant, and she travels, as is the tradition, to her home village to give birth. And on the way, unexpectedly, she goes into labour and she gives birth standing up, holding on to the branch of a tree. And some say miraculously the child emerged from the right side of her body, the right side of the body that the white elephant entered her womb. And the child's birth is surrounded by miraculous events. This is a very, very special child. But very, very tragically, 7 days later, Maya herself dies. So she sadly dies. And far away, there's a holy man, a seer, named Asita. And when the birth is taking place, he sees auspicious signs. There are auspicious signs that this child is very, very special. And he travels to speak to the father, and he tells him that this child is destined either to be a great worldly leader or a great spiritual leader. Now the king, the father, is disturbed by this because he wants an heir to his kingdom, and he wants to do everything in his power to avoid the child becoming a great spiritual teacher. He wants him to be a worldly teacher, a worldly leader. So he surrounds the child with pleasure and distraction. He marries again, and him and his new wife, raise a child, and the child becomes fit and healthy and athletic and good looking, as all good princes should be, and skilled in all arts. And he lives in the palace, and he's surrounded by all the finest things in life. And he lives a very, very sort of closeted life. He doesn't really know what goes on outside the palace walls. And eventually he marries another beautiful princess, Yashodhara, and they have a child. But his curiosity grows, and one day, as a young man, he leaves the palace. He goes out with his faithful charioteer and groom Chana. But his father, concerned about what he might see beyond the palace walls, has actually beautified the landscape around him. So wherever our young prince travels, he sees only beauty. And he returns to the palace thinking that the outside of the palace is very similar to the inside. But then there's something gnawing away at this young prince. He's got, I suppose as all young men do, he's got an urge to go out into the world. And he, as many young people do, he slips away and goes out again. And his father isn't aware that he's leaving this time and hasn't had the opportunity to beautify the route. And he sees for the first time someone very, very sick, which he's been protected from in the palace. Now, some say he goes out on separate occasions, and some say this all happens on the same journey. But basically, he sees someone sick, and he's shocked by this because he's just never seen it before. And he sees someone very old, and he's shocked by this as well, because everyone in the palace is young and beautiful and good looking. And finally, he sees a corpse, and he's really shocked by this because he's never actually experienced death. He's really, really shocked by seeing a corpse. And he returns profoundly troubled. His whole world has been turned upside down and inside out. And he slips into what we might call now a depression. He's very troubled. His world is collapsing, really. The whole way of seeing the world just doesn't seem to make sense anymore. And he throws himself into the usual pleasures, but they just start to ring a little hollow. Some say that even one night after a particular evening of pleasure with his surrounded by his maidens, the following morning he sees them all lying drooling from the drunken revelries of the night before, and he's quite disgusted by this. Others say he hears one of the beautiful entourage singing a song, the song of Nirvana, and this song makes him realise that perhaps there's more to life than what he's experiencing. Because he's looking around himself and he lives in a world where rebirth is a fact of life, and he just sees this endless round of being born, and now he realises that everyone will grow old, get sick and die, be reborn, grow old, get sick and die, endlessly rolling on for eternity. And he just can't work out how to live in a world like that. Nothing makes sense anymore. But fortunately, he's also sees a holy man, a wandering ascetic, and this ascetic seems at peace. He seems at ease in the world. He's got nothing. He's a wandering beggar who's most likely meditating, begging for alms. But there's a sort of peace about him that profoundly touches our young prince. And this, in a way, even troubles him even more, because this is such a completely different lifestyle from the life he's been living, surrounded by pleasure and luxury. And he returns to the palace, and the father redoubles his efforts to protect his son, and he's really worried now that the father's really worried that his son may leave and possibly even become a wandering ascetic himself and fulfill the destiny that's been assigned to him. So he builds even stronger walls around the palace, and he provides even more pleasure for the young prince. So that's where as far as we'll take the story today. Now, there's an awful lot to say on this, and it's very interesting. I'll begin by kind of unpacking a bit of the background of all this, because it is very interesting, this notion of what is true, because the Foresight story in particular, I won't say much about the early part of Gautama's life, but the Foresights are actually told in the Pali Canon, in the earliest sort of versions, as a teaching story. They're told kind of metaphorically. In the Arya Parisana Sutta and the Sukamala Sutta. Or interestingly, in the Mahapadana Sutta, it's told in relation to another Buddha. This is something that happens quite a lot in the Buddhist tradition, that a Buddha's life story doesn't change much. The Buddhas change, but they follow a kind of an archetypal pattern. So yes, in one sutra, it's actually even another Buddha who experiences this, and it only starts appearing as a kind of literal experience in Gautama's life in the Lalita Visvara Sutra. As I said yesterday, you'll have to forgive me. My Sanskrit and Pali pronunciation is not good, so do check these pronunciations. And even interestingly, the drunken harem with the drooling maidens, I always love that, drooling maidens, is actually told in relationship to an experience one of the Buddha's disciples has, a young man called Yasa. This is something that does actually happen quite a lot in the tradition, is that experiences of other people are kind of fused onto the Buddha to be's life story. And there's an interesting set of parallels with the founder of Jainism, Mahavira, if I remember rightly, where some of his life story and the Buddha's life story are very, very similar. There's some very curious mixing ups going on there. And just while we're unpacking the kind of historical part of this, there's quite a lot of evidence that I can only politely put it that the Buddha's backstory, his background, has been rather bigged up in terms of palaces and kings and everything else. It's probably more likely his father was a headman of a village, and his palace was probably the largest house in the village, possibly with a courtyard. There's no archaeological evidence for sort of vast palaces with high walls, and it's interesting because we get this kind of fairy tale version, don't we? It's, beautiful princesses and beautiful princes who are skilled everything. It has very much got the quality of every good fairy tale. And there's even, as a lot of you may know, the clan that Gautama was born into, the Shakyans, were said to be great warriors. But even that, there's now a bit of scholarly discussion about whether they'd actually been warriors in the past, and now they were kind of merchants and administrators. You know, they become kind of middle management, but they were still kind of trading on the fact that they were, you know, we were great warriors once. We were, you know, so that may be slightly at odds. Because I do find it interesting that if they are a clan of great warriors, we've got the inheritor of that clan not knowing anything about injury and death, which is probably not a good prerequisite of becoming a great warrior. But anyway, but I think it's really important that that's not to in any way dismiss this, because I think there's, as I'm going to go on to hopefully explore, there's such a there's so much truth, as it were, contained in this. It might not be literally true, but there's a vast amount of truth in this narrative. So on that note, I mean, I find it very, very interesting, just to begin with, just saying a little about the Gautama's birth. This auspicious birth, this miraculous conception, this being born into humble circumstances, a wise man travelling far to predict this child's greatness. I don't know about you, but I think I might have heard that story somewhere else. Just something in me somewhere seems to suggest I've heard a very similar story, which suggests a kind of archetypal truth, that there's something about this that's significant. And at the other end of the spectrum, on a very sort of, as it were, mundane psychological sense, I really wonder about this, Maya's death, Maya dying 7 days after Gautama was born. I do really wonder what psychological, from a contemporary psychological perspective, what effect would that have on your worldview? I mean, to me, if you're looking for a seed of someone looking for the cessation of suffering, to come into the world with that experience, I find it incredibly moving. Actually, I find it really quite something. I can only imagine what a formative experience that must have had. So Gautama was raised in the palace, and he's protected from old age, sickness and death. You know, he's got this overprotective family, and again, what a familiar narrative. An overprotective parent who doesn't want their child to suffer, who wants a life of kind of power and authority and ease and status and the familiar, and to follow, you know, to follow the family line, to enter the family business, to not go off into the unknown. Again, it really does make me think of the experience going on with Prince Harry at the moment. Seems very interesting parallels there of how much you follow what is expected of you, and to what extent you go in a different direction, and the resistance to that, and what a lonely path that might be. But in a sense, I think particularly in the modern West, we are so protected, aren't we, from old age, sickness and death. I got my running order slightly skewed earlier on, but old age, sickness and death. You know, you've only got to look on social media. You've only got to look on Instagram. I was thinking about the use of there's a lot of debate about this now, isn't there? The use of filters and Photoshop, in that, you know, all the wrinkles need to be removed, all the flab needs to be photoshopped away, and it seems to be we've got a kind of medieval Northern Indian equivalent of kind of photoshopping the world. It feels like Gautama's father's kind of photoshopping the world, this kind of removing of anything kind of unpleasant. Yeah, following on my theme of the royal family, I worked as an orderly in a hospital when I was 19, which was actually, to be honest, quite an experience of the four sights in some ways for a 19-year-old. But the Queen Mother was coming to visit to open a wing of the hospital, and the whole hospital got painted in the kind of month before, and even the really rotten windows. It was a very old hospital, it was Victorian, and they literally just painted over the rot. And there's an old gag in England about the royal family here. Think the world smells as fresh paint permanently, because wherever they go has been freshly painted. And this really does make me think of Gautama's father going out and you know, beautifying the world for him. So it does go on. It does go on. I once heard of a celebrity who demanded that their dressing rooms were always freshly painted, but didn't smell of fresh paint. That was very, very strong. No smell of fresh paint. But we all do this, I think. We all do this in our ways. We all find just living with the way things are, with old age, sickness and death. We all find it hard. And certainly in modern Britain, you know, we don't have people lying in open coffins normally. I was 25 years old, I think, until I saw my first dead body. I know people much older than me have never seen a dead body. A lot of us react with complete shock and surprise when we get ill. We look in the mirror and we're shocked and surprised at what time's slowly doing to us. It's amazing that we still get shocked by this, but we do. I do. And I think it's also worth this point about rebirth, particularly in relationship to death. That I think, again, there's a modern Western view that rebirth is a good thing. You know, for those of particularly more in the kind of New Age world, there's an idea that rebirth or reincarnation is somehow a good thing. You know, there'll be more life, more pleasure, more chance to do it again. It's a bit like you know, I was thinking you can watch online afterwards. You're not going to miss anything. You can just do it again. But from the worldview of ancient India, the very different view of rebirth. It was an idea that, in fact, there was just more suffering, more old age, more death, and it was just repetitive and endless. This wheel of becoming, samsara. So there's a very, very different view of rebirth than perhaps some people have today. That it's something you want to get off the wheel. You want that to stop. And the response to all this, I think we can all probably relate to, this basic response to suffering of wanting to kind of layer on a more pleasurable experience. We have an experience of suffering, and then we want to layer on something more kind of enjoyable, more pleasurable on top. And we kind of distract ourselves. We distract ourselves from how things are. I know I certainly do. We we numb out, we binge watch. I mean, binge watching, I think, is quite an obvious example of this. When you watch endless, or I watch endless television, there's a sort of numbing that takes place. You stop feeling your feelings, and it's why going on retreat can be so challenging, because we remove some of those distractions and we start to feel our feelings. I mean, I do wonder sometimes where the whole, almost you could say, quite a significant part of Dharma practice is bearing our feelings, is creating a container where we can bear our feelings and not react to them and then do things that don't help. And in that way, the wheel keeps turning. If we can bear our feelings and then respond creatively and skillfully to those feelings, not to deny them, not to push them away, not to pretend they're not there, is such a significant part of practice. Because we're surrounded by these distractions, and in a sense, you could say capitalism is built on this. Capitalism is built on selling you things that will stop you feeling your feelings, or will give you feelings that are pleasurable. That's almost what capitalism is. But of course, it doesn't work. As a friend of mine once said, we can't possibly live the lives they're selling us. We can't possibly live the lives they're selling us. I always think of this when I open those colour supplements in Sunday papers in Britain. These amazing lives people are leading. They're all beautiful and cooking amazing meals. They've got incredible careers and fantastic relationships, and everything's functional and great. But we're constantly distracting ourselves from turning towards life. There's that line from T.S. Eliot, distracted from distraction by distraction. Distracted from distraction by distraction. There's this. I always sometimes have an image like loads of duvets being laid on top of our experience, and we pile more and more on, and we're sort of quite cosy under there. And then we have these experiences that start to peel those duvets off, and we start to experience life more fully. Sometimes it comes as a shock. Life crashes in. A bereavement, a redundancy, a tragedy of some sort, an illness, and it's almost like we're woken up, in a sense, and we try and kind of reorientate ourselves to a new way of being, and we're left with this feeling of dukkha, this wonderfully described with the metaphor, the ill-fitting chariot wheel. Something's not quite right. The clothes are a little too small. You can't quite scratch the itch. This sort of sense of nothing's quite enough. I'm sure we've all had these experiences where you kind of think, well, it's not quite enough. It doesn't quite. There's got to be more than this. It is, though, important also to stress that the Dharma is not saying that there isn't pleasure in this life. Of course there's pleasure in this life. But it will be impermanent. It will be impermanent, and it won't ultimately scratch the itch. It'll be, again, if we can accept life's pleasures on their own terms, and as Blake said, kiss the winged joy as it flies, then there is an awful lot of pleasure to be had in this life. It's when we want it to give more than it can give, really, is when we really get ourselves into trouble. And it's also worth stressing the way that the Dharma will often slightly try and shock us. So out of this distraction. So there'll be quite a lot of emphasis on, unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, insubstantiality, reflections on death. It goes as far as the traditional reflections on the decomposition of the corpse, which is fairly full on practice. And unfortunately, this can present to some people, they can come away with an image that the Dharma is pretty nihilistic. I don't think it is. It's just using kind of almost shock tactics to wake us up. It's interesting in the Thai forest tradition, for example, the monks in Thailand, if they've got an arrangement with with one of the main hospitals, I think in Bangkok, where the monks go watch autopsies to really kind of to really sort of, this is the nature of a human body. This is the nature of a human body. But obviously, if you're of a kind of more nihilistic temperament, as I am, it's really, really important to also stress the pleasure and the positive, and it's so important that it doesn't. We don't allow ourselves to slip into despair. I'll say more about that later. So for me, I can really see how Gautama's left asking really fundamental questions. He's been going along his life in a particular way, and suddenly there's this waking up, this seeing beyond the palace walls. You can see how the imagery is so evocative of that experience. I'm sure we've all had those experiences. I mean, in some of the versions, again, the facts, as it were, do change from version to versions. In some of the versions, this happens when he's a teenager, and there is a kind of theory about the brain rewiring itself as teenagers. As an animal, we're gearing up to leave home, to leave, as a mammal, we're very unusual, aren't we? In that we stay with our parents for a long time, and there's this sense of almost being shocked out of the nest. We go out into the world just as Gautama has. Or in other versions, it comes much later in life, where he's maybe between 27, 29 years old, and I mean, don't take this too literally, but in some of the astrological traditions, there's this idea of Saturn returns when one's 27 or 29, and quite often there's a crisis of meaning around this time. This actually happened to me personally. So there can often be around that time this crisis, and it's often a time where we in a sense really move into adulthood. And we start to experience what David Whyte calls our adult aloneness. Our adult aloneness. Very evocative phrase. And it's interesting that the Pali Canon, and this is particularly, I remember reading this in Reginald Ray's Buddhist Saints in India, how many people in the Pali Canon actually go forth into the wandering life, into the Buddhist tradition, after they've experienced quite a profound shock, quite often a bereavement. Think of story of Kisagotami, for example. There's that the reality of life has really crashed in on them. And that's kind of been the thing that has driven them to practice. I know it was my experience of dukkha that led me to practice. And in the tradition, there's this term samvega, which is the yearning or a sense of urgency to experience something beyond dukkha. And that becomes the catalyst for virya, this energy in pursuit of the good, that is the engine of our practice, that gives us the engagement, the need, the kind of the longing for something more. And it's a bit like the way a pain in the body leads us to do something about it. It's only if you're anything like me, it's only when you're in real pain that you'll actually start looking after your body. Unfortunately, and T.S. Eliot again, he says in the poem East Cocker, the sickness that must grow worse in order to find healing. The sickness that must grow worse in order to find healing. I think of this in terms of those rumble strips that you get on the side of the road in Britain, where they, if you're falling asleep or whatever and you drift off, they paint these ridges along the side of the road that start to make the car vibrate, and they'll wake you up. We have these kind of rumble strips in life, and we often want to kind of avoid that. We don't want to wake up, and we want to stay asleep. And I think often this is the root of addiction. Addiction comes out of that desire. We just can't bear our feelings. We just cannot bear our feelings. And unfortunately, tragically, we'll get involved in behaviours that numb the pain, but kill the joy, as the song goes. That we numb out. We numb out. And unfortunately, as anyone who's experienced addiction knows, it doesn't work. It just eventually makes things worse. It's almost like once we realise something, we have to try really hard not to. You have to try really hard to go back to sleep, and I don't know if you've experienced this with truths. You realise something and you don't want to realise it, and then you have to. It takes quite a lot of effort to suppress the experience. And I equate this with Gautama's father building these kind of stronger walls, more pleasure, bigger walls. There's a sort of desperation about it that we all do, as opposed to this turning towards experience, this clear seeing, the four sights. Once it's seen, you can't unsee. You can't get the genie back in the bottle. But the important thing, I think, to really remember is this fourth sight, that he sees the wandering ascetic, and there's a sense of somebody more at ease in the world, more at peace. There's a sort of Gautama's sort of worldview is completely expanded, completely opened up. And again, I think it's really, and I'd maybe ask you to maybe reflect on this, about experiences in your life where that's happened. We've all had it. You read a book, you see a film, someone says something to you, you meet somebody, a mentor or an artist or a band or a writer, or we have these experiences where our world suddenly gets bigger. We see a different perspective. I was thinking about this in relationship to my own life, and they might be particularly holy figures, but it's worth remembering that the word holy is whole, comes from whole. The holy life's about living a whole life, which I think is really important to remember. It's a whole life. We're trying to include everything. I had this experience when I was 16. I went to the Royal College of Art degree show, and to a kind of working class lad who, no one in my family had been to higher education or anything, to go to the Royal College of Art up in London. It was such a profound experience. It was like gone through the wardrobe from in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, or uh, yeah, I'll say more about that in a moment. It's a sort of gateway to another world. And also, for those of you of a certain age who were brought up in Britain, you might understand this. We used to have just 3 television stations, and this 4th television station came online in the 1980s, Channel 4, imaginatively titled. And it was, I suppose, the equivalent of public service broadcasting. It was very alternative. It was very controversial. They really pushed the boundaries, but they showed all sorts of very, in the early days, it was very experimental, very progressive, and all these sort of European art house films. And as a young man, I'd sit in my bedroom with the tiny little portable television. The screen was tiny, the back of it was about that deep, and I'd watch these kind of European films. Again, my world just suddenly just completely expanded. It was like there was a whole world out there that was very different to the world that I knew. And then, I was very, very fortunate that I did end up going to art college myself, and had a similar experience. It was like, wow, it just was this whole different world opened up to me. And eventually, I was blessed by the fact that as a young man, the age of 25, I came across the London Buddhist Centre, and I remember. I mean, I think this is possibly quite similar. Dare I say it? Quite similar to maybe Gautama's experience of seeing the Holy Man. But I could distinctly remember meeting these people, some of the order members there, and I'm sure there was a huge amount of projection going on as well. But I remember clearly thinking, I don't know what they've got, but I want some of it. I don't know what they've got, but I was your archetypal angry young man, pretty depressed, struggling, and these people seemed more at peace in the world than I was. And I thought, wow, there's a door here, there's a fire exit, there's a way through. And interestingly enough, just as I've been talking about truth and mythologizing, I had a whole series of quite extraordinary synchronicities, coincidences, almost magical experiences that led me to the London Buddhist Centre. But they were also quite mundane in a way. They were coincidences. They weren't sort of, there weren't words written in fire in the sky or anything. But they were. There's a very interesting set of coincidences and synchronicities that happened. And years later, someone came up to me and they said, "Are you the Nagasiddhi?" Which immediately my ego, the Nagasiddhi. Oh, I love that. The Nagasiddhi. And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm that Nagasiddhi." And they said, "And you're the guy who?" And they recounted a version of that they'd heard from somebody who probably heard it from someone who heard it from somebody, of how I'd become involved with what's become Tri Ratna and the London Buddhist Centre. And it was quite an interesting experience, because it was like someone had given my life and giving it to a kind of Hollywood scriptwriter and director, and they'd written this kind of amazing version of it that was almost did have words written in fire in the sky kind of thing. It was like someone had looked at it and gone, "Oh, we need a few more special effects in there. We need a bit more drama. We need a bit more." And I think this is basically what happens. And I imagine this is what's happened with the Buddha's life, that he had these experiences that have a real, don't get me wrong, they have a real profundity to them, and they are life-changing, and they are magical, and they are special, and they are important, and they are significant. But they're also really mundane. They're really kind of normal and ordinary. But it's almost like if you, as I was saying yesterday, it's almost like if you took an X-ray, you'd see the mythological. It's a way of communicating these truths, but it's not. It's not possibly the actual lived experience. Um, so I think that's really important to sort of bear that in mind, and it's not in any way to diminish anything. I really, really don't mean to diminish any aspect of the Buddha and the significance of what he did and achieved, and it changed my life. I mean, really don't know if I'd be here today without it. But I think it's just a different way of truth telling, and unfortunately, in the modern world, that can be seen as being not true. Myth is used. Oh, it's a myth. It's not. And sometimes people, when you say, "Oh, something's a myth," they think you're diminishing it. Actually, for me, to describe something as a myth actually says, no, this is really important. This is really significant. This has real truths contained within it. So I'm sure you've all had your own experiences. You wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be here on this retreat if you hadn't had some sort of experience of dukkha, and you hadn't had some sort of experience of a path that led from dukkha, some sort of experience of the four sights yourself. And some of us might have experienced that as a kind of a call in some ways. This kind of call for something, this kind of Krishnamurti, I think one of Krishnamurti's books was called Freedom from the Known. This sense of what I talked about yesterday, about these rites of passage being an initiation. They're an initiation into a bigger, more expanded worldview, an opening up of the mind, a bigger perspective. And fairy tales are full of this, aren't they? Mandarava touched on this last night about the forest. There's this very familiar image from fairy tale and myth of the protagonist sometimes sees a white deer and follows the white deer off the familiar path into the forest, and that's just what happens to Parsifal, and that's where the adventure begins. Interestingly, the white deer becomes a white rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Alice is, I think she's at a picnic, isn't she? And she's led from the known into the unknown, into this completely different world. As I mentioned in the Narnia stories, something as mundane as a wardrobe becomes a gateway to something completely different and expanded. And Hagrid turns up, doesn't he, in the suburban cul-de-sac and takes him away. To his whole worldview, his whole kind of sense of reality gets completely kind of blown apart. So you can see, I hope, that there's this very deep archetypal pattern in human experience of the desire to go from the known to the unknown, from the reactive mind to the creative mind, from small mind to big mind, the conditioned to the unconditioned, this kind of yearning, this longing. So just to finish off, just to say, we have these experiences of the four, particularly the first three sights of the dukkha inherent in existence, and it's very understandable to respond to that with a sense of sort of depression or bleakness or hopelessness. It's also really, really, really important to stress this experience of samvega, that also becomes the impetus for us to practice, to search, to look for something beyond those limited experiences, and that becomes virya. That becomes, and you certainly see this in the Buddha's life, this kind of phenomenal drive, which we'll go into over the next few days, to to experience the cessation of suffering, and then fortunately for us to share that with others. And this brings us to the term pasada, this which is, the confidence in the Dharma, the confidence in the practice. And this, I think, is connected to the fourth sight, that we have this confidence that there is a path. There's a sort of pathless path. That's the interesting thing. We've got a map that leads into the unknown, if that's not a koan. We've got. That's one of the things that really I find so important about the Dharma, is that it acknowledges that it's a map that leads to beyond the map. Just as the Heart Sutra says so sort of clearly, and that way we can avoid the dangers of fundamentalism, and we can keep the deep mystery at the heart of the Dharma alive. Because without that sense of mystery, things just ossify and turn into dogma and become fixed and rigid and brittle, and they wither and die, unfortunately. So we all in our practice really need to keep hold of that sense of mystery. And if you are feeling a little low, a little down about all this old age, sickness and death, it is always really important to remember this particular story does have a happy ending. There is a spoiler alert in this, that he does actually experience awakening. I'm sure you all know the story. So here's just a few little reflections for you. Maybe I'll put these up on the Padlet as well, but it might be worth just reflecting on what your own experience is. If it's not too much for you, obviously take responsibility for yourself. You might reflect on your own experiences of the four sights. Don't go there if it's not healthy. But particularly this experience of the fourth sight, I think it's really, really important to emphasise this. Your experience of the fourth sight, and that might be reading a book as a child. It might be seeing a film. It might be meeting the Dalai Lama. I don't know, but whatever it. There's some beacon we've all seen in our lives that suggested something more. And it's really important to maybe dwell on where we draw our inspiration from. And I think it's really, really important not to bring a kind of Buddhist sort of snobbery to this. We're inspired by what we're inspired by. There's no sort of hierarchy of inspiration. You might be, I don't know, Pink Floyd might be your inspiration, or it might be Mozart. But the heart responds to what the heart responds to. Thinking about Pink Floyd, talk about Comfortably Numb is a very interesting. The lyrics to Comfortably Numb say an awful lot about a response to, into life. So where do you draw your inspiration from, and what do these carry for you? So, for example, my experience of seeing the Royal College of Art degree show opened up a world of creativity. It held the value of creativity. Channel 4, it was different perspectives, different worldviews, different cultures from my own. I think the thing that I mainly got, in a sense, from my first encounters with the London Buddhist Centre were emotional positivity. There was a joy, a lightness, a happiness that I experienced in some of the people there. So what are the values that those experiences held for you? And what aligns your life in the here and now more with those values, more with the fourth sight? How can you kind of follow that guiding star more in your life? I kind of, it makes me, using my own examples, what are the conditions I need to live out my own creativity? Can I still be open to different perspectives, to bigger worldviews? Working on my own emotional positivity and a clear seeing without collapsing into negativity. I find, on that note, I find the poet Seamus Heaney such a fantastic example of someone who can really look life square in the eye in his poems, but yet he never collapses into negativity. There's always this sense of mystery and wonder in his poetry, but he doesn't shy away from things as they are and the difficult truths of life. And so that's certainly an inspiration for me. And it might be for you to reflect on this material. Is, you might write something, you might draw something, you might make something, you might place a picture of someone who inspires you on your shrine or on your mantelpiece. You might read poetry or books or listen to music, or what lifts your spirit, touches your heart. So yeah, find your way. I think it's so important we find our way to practice. You find your own way of connecting with the Dharma. There's no prescriptions for this stuff. And just to say, I've got my Gautama is looking out of his binoculars at the rather sad image of a hospital bed and seeing life as it is. But fortunately, he has got his foresight too of he's looking in the mirror, as it were. He's got an image of the Buddha to be and Green Tara, who embody all that mystery.